Welcome to the Bible with Ethan. Did you know that the biblical creation story is not the only creation story that's been found in the ancient Middle East? Not only this, but some of these pagan stories do seem to share some similarities with the Bible's. Is this a problem for the truth of Scripture? Or can this in some way actually help us understand what we read in the Bible? Find out that and more in the video ahead. Over the last several hundred years, archaeologists have unearthed all sorts of material from the ancient peoples in the Old Testament period. Those looking to disprove the truth of scriptures argue that what we read in Genesis is not unique. In fact, it's borrowed material from ancient pagan creation stories. Perhaps one of the best things to do when evaluating a claim like this is to actually read the material for yourself, especially before parroting whatever academic opinion that best fits your persuasion. I've actually linked the text that we'll be comparing today in the description below, and it's free to access. We'll be looking at the Babylonian epic of creation, or better known as the Enuma Elish. And this is one of the ones that's more commonly cited in comparing ancient creation stories to the biblical creation stories, specifically Genesis 1. Now, if you're like me growing up as a kid who read and loved getting into Greek mythology, then you're going to find yourself right at home in this story. It's action-packed and all sorts of crazy stuff goes on between the gods. In fact, I think we're only a couple years away from Marvel getting a hold of this story and incorporating it into their superhero movies. Anyways, to give an outline of the rest of this video, I'm going to summarize the story of the Enuma Elish. And along the way, I'm going to point out some similarities between it and Genesis 1. And then I'm going to kind of give some final thoughts on what kind of stories I think that each of these are trying to be. That is, what do they say and what are their purposes? What are they trying to teach about God, humanity, and the world we live in? The Enuma Elish. Our story begins by describing the universe before it was created. It says, "This is when nothing is named. There are no heavens or gods, only water. Then, at some point, out of this water, two gods come to be. These are Apsu, the freshwater god, and Tiamat, the saltwater god. These gods have children and make other gods, which make other gods. And very quickly, like in every household, the children make lots of noise and disturb Apsu and Tiamat." I'm going to pause our story for 1 second because there's already some things here that we can compare. One similarity is that both of these stories actually begin in a time before creation, when the world itself is uncreated. Secondly, we also see that both stories reference water in this time period. Now, this is rather unusual, and it's also a point of debate between many scholars. Many think that this might actually be some substance from which all of the world is made, a material substance. Others, like John Walton, a biblical scholar, will say that this is more of just an allusion to kind of an uncreated chaos. I think one good argument for at least here in the Enuma Elish is that if we think about ancient people's understanding of water, both saltwater and freshwater make up all of what they think water is. And salt and freshwater gods come into existence sometime later in the process of creation. So this water really wouldn't make sense if it was real, but I'm not going to die on that hill. As for the differences between these stories, the story starts in Genesis 1 with God already existing and alone, with no one else there beside him. I think this points to Judaism's monotheism, that is, belief in one God. Secondly, we also see that God is apart from creation. When he's hovering over the waters, it reveals that he is not the waters themselves and does not rise out of them or come from them to any degree. This is also an allusion to a third point of difference where God is sovereign over creation. That is, he is hovering over them, in control of them, by the way that a lot of times sovereignty is communicated in the Bible. So back to the story. The divine children are making lots of noise, which makes Apsu angry. Apsu tells Tiamat that he intends to destroy the children, but Tiamat, who's more forgiving, instead becomes upset with Apsu and his plan. However, word gets out of Apsu's plan, and the lesser god, Ea, promptly devises a plan to kill Apsu before he strikes. Ea casts a magical spell on Apsu, which puts him to sleep and then allows him to kill him. Thus, all of the lesser gods are saved. Soon after this, the noise returns, and Tiamat rages with the slaying of her spouse. So she creates all sorts of monsters, demons that are half men, half lion, or half scorpion men. She creates all sorts of weapons of war. Trust me on this. Marvel, you need to make this happen. Continuing, she even names a champion to fight for her, Kinju. Ea, the hero god, gets scared, and after he regains his courage, he tries his magic on Tiamat, but it doesn't work. Then Ea's son Marduk steps up, and he claims that he can kill Tiamat. But all the other gods must name him king once he has done this. They agree, and they have a huge party where they bring him gifts to help him control the wind and the storms. After this, a huge battle takes place. Marduk captures Tiamat and her minions and then crushes her head. Then he takes the carcass of Tiamat and separates it into two pieces. With one half, he makes the heavens and the constellations, the courses of the sun and the moon, and a heavenly temple. With the other half, he makes the earth and the underworld, and finally, the city of Babylon. Now here I want to pause real quick to make some more points of comparison. And you might be thinking, what on earth is comparable between what I just heard in Genesis 1? But there are some points that might match up. One is the ordering of creation. In both stories, the heavens are made first, and then earth and the things that are contained inside the earth. Now, the ordering isn't precise or line by line, but there is some similarity in the ordering. Second point of comparison is that, and I think this one is rather skeptical, is that the winds subdue the waters of creation. Now, to get to this point, some scholars will say that ruach, which is a Hebrew word for spirit, when we read Spirit of God hovering over the waters, this Hebrew word ruach can also mean wind. So we have the wind of God hovering over the waters. I think this is a bit of a stretch, especially because Genesis doesn't really pull on this theme of the winds being used by God. In fact, it mainly highlights God speaking more than anything. But in the Enuma Elish, we see Marduk using the weapons of wind to actually capture Tiamat and her minions. All that said, I think this one's a bit of a scholarly reach. And now for some more differences. One, God is unchallenged in his creating. He does not create in resistance to anything. He simply does what he wants. Two, God also creates effortlessly. He does this by speaking things and they come into existence. This is not the same story of a battle story where the hero has to use all of his might and blood and sweat to defeat the enemy. In fact, you want the hero to work hard in that kind of a story. This story, no. God shows sovereignty simply by making a command, and then it happens. 3, we also see that the process of creation for Genesis 1 is increasingly good. The scriptures say that, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and then finally, and God saw that it was very good. But in the Enuma Elish, it's all over the place. It's ups and downs, it's fighting and celebrating. 2 different stories. And 4, we also see that God's creation in Genesis 1 is one that increases in order and stability. There's a pattern between the first 3 days of creation and the following 3 days of creation. If you are unfamiliar, then this is a good time to just simply read it real quick for yourself, where days 4 through 6 actually populate what is made in days 1 through 3. Anyways, let's go ahead and finish our story. After Marduk creates the heavens and the earth with Tiamat's dead body, he then gets the idea to create slaves so that the gods can get some rest. These are, of course, humans. Marduk decides to take Tiamat's champion that he conquered, Kinju, and slay him so that he might use his blood to make humankind. This he does, and so humanity is taught how to properly worship the gods in Babylon, which becomes the center of Mesopotamian worship in the world. Marduk then decides which gods will help him rule over the heavenly places, over the earth and humanity, and then over the netherworld. Marduk, of course, places himself as the head god of all. And that's the end of our story. All right, so we're going to look at our final points of similarity. 1, humanity in both stories is created last. We also see 2, there is a division of rulership underneath the head deity. In the Enuma Elish, different gods are assigned to different realms, and humanity is given the jobs as slaves of the gods. In Genesis 1, we see also that there are stars appointed to rule the night and the day, verses 16 and 18. We also see humanity is also given dominion to rule over the face of the earth. And for our final points of difference, 1, all of humanity is granted rulership in the Genesis 1 account. This is something that's unparalleled between the Genesis story and other pagan creation stories. Generally, such a title of privilege is restricted to just a king or a high priest. But here, no, it's all males, all females. Implicitly, every race is dignified with being the image bearer of God, and thereby having dominion over the face of the earth. Secondly, we see that all of creation in the Genesis story is fine-tuned for human flourishing. In the Enuma Elish, all of creation is for the gods. Even humanity is created to serve the gods as slaves. Not so in Genesis. And for our third and final point of difference, we see that all of humanity is invited to rest with God on the seventh day. Now, while this isn't explicitly stated in the Genesis 1 account or the little bit that extends into Genesis 2, we do see later the institution of Sabbath law, which points back to the seventh day of creation as men and women should rest with God. So what do you think of our comparison today? Do you think that Genesis 1 is borrowed material? Personally, I don't see that the few similarities that we have found compromise at all the truth of the biblical account. Where we do see similarities, I can see that Moses knows he must speak in familiar terminology to a people who are entrenched in pagan stories, be they creation stories or whatever else. Therefore, he must use platforms of concepts that they already are familiar with to then use and then insert differences, truth, so that way he can correct their view of the world. These differences then could explain who God really is, who they really are, what the world is created for, and why. This we do see, and it's a very different story than the ones that we find in Egypt, here in Babylon, or in other places across the ancient Middle East. I want to finish with some final thoughts about the stories that we see here. The Enuma Elish is a very different story in that it is written so that it glorifies war, violence, cultural dominance, as well as Marduk himself and the various elements of the Babylonian culture. Genesis 1, on the other hand, glorifies the uncontested sovereignty of God. He brings order into a world of chaos, making it fit and flourishing for life. Not only this, but God also gives to all of humanity, male, female, and every race, the image-bearing privilege of reflecting God himself to a world. And I cannot emphasize this enough. This is such a unique feature that we see this nowhere in any other religion, the image-bearing privilege to all of creation. That's almost always restricted to just the king himself. So at the end of the day, we don't see a story that's trying to assert a cultural dominance over other cultures. Instead, it's solely concerned about the sovereignty of God and also the inherent dignity of humankind. Well, that brings us to the end of our video, and thank you so much for watching. If you found any value in what you've seen today, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, study well and glorify the King.